I'm really excited to help facilitate today's conversation and to hear from our wonderful panel. So during this session, we will discuss the challenges and opportunities for welcoming refugees to Oregon, and we'll get to talk to the very first people that families interact with once they arrive to the United States, which are the local resettlement agencies. I hope that folks were here for the last presentation to kind of get a little bit of foundation, but if you weren't, it'll be recorded and we can watch back. But as Matthew was mentioning, there are more than 100 million refugees in the world today. And in the previous administration, there were more than 100 programs that were closed. But unlike that national trend, Oregon has actually been expanding refugee resettlement across the state. So we've expanded from 3 to 6 local resettlement agencies. And today we'll have the opportunity to hear from many of these organizations. If you're here with a local resettlement agency, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We've got 4 folks on our panel, but I know there are others who are joining us today. So we'll start off with our introduction and then move into our Q&A. And as you hear from the panelists, please put any questions you have in the chat. We can answer those. So we'll get started with Matthew Westerbeck, Director of Refugee Services at Catholic Charities of Oregon. Since the 1980s, Catholic Charities has resettled more than 10,500 refugees fleeing persecution to Oregon. And Catholic Charities is a part of a larger national resettlement network to coordinate resettlement at the national and local level. So I will kick it off to Matthew. Can you share more about your work? And if you can answer one of our questions that we have about how the decisions that are made at the federal and state level impact refugee resettlement in Oregon.
Thanks, Mical. Hi, everybody. Good to see everybody again. If you're just joining for the first time, my name is Matthew Westbrook. I'm the Director of Refugee Services at Catholic Charities of Oregon, he, him pronouns. I've been blessed, honored, privileged, and incredibly rewarding to work in refugee resettlement for nearly 6 years. I don't know how else to say it. I joined this work as a volunteer about 10 years ago, and I joined staff 2 weeks before the 2016 election, and have been with our team and with our families and communities that we serve and our partners in this work, been through all these challenges in immigration and in refugee resettlement. And because of those challenges at the federal level and with the previous administration, our work has pivoted and evolved quite a bit in the last 5 years. And some of that insight, I think, is important to share, because I think our goals of encouraging and creating much more community involvement in the participation in welcoming refugees has come from our efforts to stabilize the refugee settlement network in Oregon, to broaden it, to improve it, to make sure that we are being really intentional partners with other CBOs and community organizations, really looking at the gaps at many different levels. And because of that, we are now much more involved in advocacy and local government engagement. Senator John is here. He's been a partner in this work for a long time, and I had the privilege and pleasure of meeting him the first time in 2018 or 19. I can't remember, as we were getting ready for House Bill 2508. Yeah, 2018. Yeah. It's just an honor to be a part of this work and serving refugees and forced migrants. So I want to start on 2 things, really, I just want to touch on. The federal level and some of the state work that we've done to address the gaps and how Oregon has stepped up. So to start at the federal level, give some context. Every year, there's the presidential determination. Only the president has the sole authority to welcome refugees into the country or to authorize refugee resettlement. Congress funds the work, they provide the dollars, but it is truly only the office of the president who says whether or not we welcome a single refugee into the United States in any given year. They set the level, then the total number of folks that we will welcome. And refugee resettlement has a very strong bipartisan history in Oregon, or sorry, in Washington, D.C. and in Oregon, but to focus in on Washington, D.C. first at that federal level. It has historically been one of the very few issues that both parties not only agree on, but jointly advocate for. Here in Oregon, our, I think, well-known former Senator Mark Hatfield gave a very impassioned speech in 1980 when the Refugee Act 1980 was being passed. Under President Reagan, Republican President Reagan, large numbers of refugees, the largest number of refugees in a single year for a couple of years in a row, were welcomed under his administration. And there is stability and consistency in that bipartisanship in terms of funding. Refugee resettlement is funded by the federal government almost exclusively. Oregon is only one of 3 states that provide state funding. Well, I'll touch on that. But that funding is literally attached to every single person that we welcome as an agency, as a program. It's a per capita funding scheme. And so when that commitment that we had as a country going back to the end of World War II and becoming very formalized in 1980 with the Refugee Act, when that is eroded and refugee numbers are severely decreased, I think the goal was quite clear for the programs, the network across the country to be so destabilized that it would erode 100% and go away. 100 programs, as Mical noted, were forced to close in the Trump administration because of lack of funding or decreases in funding. And the remaining programs were all very much smaller in size. So we saw those impacts in 2017, 2020. And if our programs here in Oregon were not able to stay open, thousands of newly and recently arrived refugees would have lost one of the key service providers that they reach out to, just as they were rebuilding their lives and getting on their feet. And what we were able to do here in Oregon, as we saw this happening, and if we were able to engage the public about who refugees are, if the public was better informed about the work and process of refugee resettlement, the history of refugee resettlement, the humanitarian need for state and our country to maintain our commitment that the policymakers, legislators, the community at large would not stand for this dismantling of a humanitarian response and humanitarian aid. So at the time, in 2018, going into 2019, the 3 active organizations in refugee resettlement, along with advocacy groups, we approached the state government and asked Oregon to step up in a way that almost no other state has. And despite long odds in a very contentious legislative session, we were able to create state funding for case management for newly and recently arrived refugees. House Bill 2508 is the sole mechanism still at this time that provides stable and reliable funding to the refugee resettlement service provider infrastructure. We now call this extended case management. You might hear us call it ECM. It is definitely a firm commitment from the state of Oregon. I think it also represents a sea change in recognizing that case management for newly arrived refugees is not complete in only 90 days. 90 days is what the federal infrastructure really allows for folks to be brand new to the country and then be pushed through a very fast service delivery package and then on their own. ECM allows us to serve families for up to 24 months over the first 5 years, looking at many different domains of thriving. I think this is much more than self-sufficiency. That's the federal definition of when cases need to be closed, or is the benchmark for them, are they self-sufficient? That really is only if they no longer qualify for public cash benefits. That's a very small, low bar. Thriving requires a lot more effort, much more client-focused, person-centered, trauma-informed. That's what ECM allows the state of Oregon to provide to recently and newly arrived refugees. And I think what we've also seen is that work that we did in 2019 with the state government, with policymakers, with advocates, with more stakeholders. It also, I think, helped pave the way for our ability as a state, with all of the housing challenges and obstacles that we have here in Oregon, to come together late last year and provide necessary and adequate resources for the nearly 1,000 Afghans who are already here in Oregon. Senator John, Representative Confam are the key legislators leading that charge. And I think if we continue to build on these foundations and truly want to remain a welcoming state for refugees and forced migrants, then we need to continue to adapt and evolve and innovate in order to make sure Oregon is a welcoming new home for those who are seeking safety, seeking refuge, and have fled persecution and are looking for us to help them as they rebuild their lives. So those are the two things, that federal level and that state response, how now Oregon is really filling the gaps and continuing to see how we need to improve and become better. I'll kick it back to you, Mical.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew. That's a very helpful foundation to continue our conversation on, and to highlight some of the successes that the advocacy successes that have happened in Oregon. And so up next, we have Luke Glaze, who's the executive director of Salem for Refugees. Salem for Refugees began as a co-sponsor for Catholic Charities in 2016. And during its 5 years, helped to resettle over 375 individuals from 14 different countries. Since officially becoming a refugee resettlement agency in 2021, Salem for Refugees has built additional capacity and has joined Oregon's resettlement network with a focus on resettling in our capital city. So Salem for Refugee focuses on forging strong, welcoming relationships between the Salem community and the newest arriving families. So I'm really excited to have you here, Luke. Luke, can you share more about your work and how the global humanitarian crises impact refugee resettlement in Oregon?
Yes, thank you so much, Mical. I'd be happy to. Can you all see my slides? Can you give a nod? Great. All right. So as Mical said, I am just excited to be able to share on behalf of Salem for Refugees a trend that is starting to take place in the state of Oregon, which is resettlement services being offered outside the Portland metro area. We're seeing an expansion of resettlement throughout our state, both through resettlement agencies and new sponsorship opportunities that are opening up. As Mical said, my name is Luke Glaze, and I'm the executive director of Salem for Refugees. And as Matthew mentioned, it is my honor and privilege not only to serve here in Salem, but also to be a part of this broader network of resettlement agencies in the state of Oregon working together to make sure that all refugees have an opportunity to thrive. So a bit of our history: how does a resettlement agency start up? Well, I don't know if we had a common path, but resettlement in Salem had really not been around for quite some time. Really, the last time that resettlement was taking place actively in Salem was in the 70s and 80s with Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian refugees through the sponsorship model. But after resettlement became more professionalized throughout the United States, we saw that resettlement for decades really just existed within the Portland metro area. And at the time, that was a great option for most refugees coming to our state. But in 2015, under the leadership of Toksonalege Gillespie, she started to consider what would it look like to see Salem as a welcoming community for refugee resettlement. And Matthew Westerbeck actually joined the team shortly thereafter. And the Salem community started to have a buzz about what it would look like to welcome refugees actively into our community. It started with just 5 lunch meetings, very informal and open to anyone in our community wanting to be involved. And those first meetings had civic leaders, churches, faith communities, the Islamic Center, Salem Kaiser School District, and many other partners all coming together to learn what it would take to be a welcoming city. And at the end of those 5 meetings, Doug and Anya Holcomb, our founders, were at the meeting and presented an idea of forming this group called Salem for Refugees. And the entire group voted yes, and Salem for Refugees was established. Salem for Refugees then operated as a co-sponsor. You may or may not be familiar with this term, but it's the idea that we were not an official resettlement agency, but we were supporting, at this time, Catholic Charities with their cases. They would send cases to Salem and provide some support to our team, but there was a lot of volunteer support and community supports that could be provided for those refugees settling in our community. As this group developed and formed, we came around these kind of foundational principles, which is our mission, to bring people and resources together to empower refugees to thrive. From the beginning, Salem for Refugees was very people-centered, bringing people from all over the community together to welcome refugees. We also wanted to kind of capitalize on the resources available, donation items, couches, beds, host homes, all the things that our community was bringing forth to the table to welcome refugees. We stand on 3 distinctives, which is mutually transformative relationships, the idea that as a volunteer or someone working with refugees, we are able to get back just as much as we're contributing. And if you take that open and humble posture, you will have a lot to learn and a lot of ways that you can be impacted for the good. We also believe heavily in empowerment, the idea that it's easy to step in the way of refugees, but we want to give them the tools and resources and empower them to make their own decisions and to have their own agency. And finally, the idea of people of faith and people of goodwill. From the beginning, Salem for Refugees had been open to both of these distinct groups, people coming together with shared values and not divided on maybe religious lines or political lines. So we continued with this model for about 5 years, and last year in 2021, we were reached out to by World Relief, a national resettlement agency, about becoming an official affiliate and joining the network. And we said yes, and we're moving towards the process of getting our State Department approvals, when in the summer of 21, we were approached about getting an early approval and jumping into the Afghan resettlement effort. So in the last 6 years, 5 of those years as a co-sponsor for Catholic Charities, and the last year as a resettlement agency, we have 350 active volunteers at any given time, 50 community partners, 35 faith communities, and we have welcomed over 500 refugees now from 16 different countries who speak 22 different languages. Our community is different today, and for the good, compared to what it was 5 or 6 years ago. We are starting to see the rich benefits of resettlement and the impact that refugees are having in our community. So Mical asked me to speak briefly on kind of some of the challenges with what we've seen recently with these unique humanitarian crises that have led to mass resettlement efforts in our communities. So I will speak both to the Afghan evacuation and resettlement effort, as well as the current Ukrainian effort. We have seen some unique challenges with this kind of new model. This is really have not been the norm for resettlement, but with these kind of direct resettlement efforts, we've seen a rapid nature of resettlement that's beyond anything we've experienced before, especially after everything Matthew shared about how decimated the resettlement network was at the time. So a pace of arrivals coming in so fast, staff working overtime, and really a challenge for our offices. We've also experienced constantly changing environments. With both of these resettlement efforts, it felt like almost on a weekly basis, the rules were changing underneath us, and we were having to grapple with new policy changes, new funding sources, and it was definitely fatiguing for our organizations. And then major staffing challenges, as you all know, in this environment, both trying to rebuild and receiving a higher pace of arrivals than most organizations have had in quite some time was a great challenge. On the other side, we saw some great successes, I think, from this last year. We saw an influx of support that helped rebuild resettlement agencies. There is more funding, more interest from volunteers and community organizations than maybe ever before. It helped bring awareness to our community of refugees all over the world. It might have started with the news article about refugees from Ukraine or Afghanistan, but it's opened the eyes and minds and hearts of people in our community for all refugees. And finally, we've seen a shift in the resettlement kind of nature back to a bipartisan support. It seemed to be getting fairly political at one season there, and I feel like both of these resettlement efforts have brought us more to a grounded center of seeing the need and value for this in our community, regardless of where you stand politically. So I wanted to show just this quick graph that I put up here of another challenge, which is disparities that we're seeing as we have now begun to treat refugees from different groups or different communities with varying levels of support. This is by no means exhaustive, but it shows you how you could be from a refugee from Afghanistan, Ukraine, or in this case, as an example, Syria, and have very differing services and resources available to you. For example, within our current funding as a state, we have lots of extra support for Afghan refugees, a lot of that due to the rapid nature of their resettlement effort, but some of those same services don't carry on from one group to the next. Currently, we are grappling with these equity issues as we might have one family from Syria who is not allowed to stay in short-term housing provided by our state or receive rental assistance. And we have another family who from Afghanistan who are receiving those services. And often they're sitting together in the same classrooms for our cultural orientation modules and interacting together, but starting to see these disparities that exist. Our fear is that these disparities can grow into resentment or comparison within refugee communities, or even from refugees to the resettlement agencies, a frustration of how services are being provided. It honestly also creates a lot of wasted time and energy at all levels due to the variations, reporting requirements, and funding streams as we treat each group differently. It's added a lot of maybe unnecessary complexity. Finally, it doesn't allow for the flexibility of utilizing funds for our most vulnerable families, as funds are tied to specific groups of people rather than having that flexibility. So again, what I want you to hear is not that in any way the resettlement agencies are not grateful for the state support for Afghans or for Ukrainians or for other refugees. But what we do want to say is, okay, now moving forward, what are the things that we can do to take the lessons learned from these most recent resettlement efforts, and how can we integrate those into a consistent floor of services that are provided for all refugees who enter our state? So for my last slide, I just want to pose us all with this question. How can we continue to provide critical support, equity to all refugees calling Oregon home? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luke. And I especially thank you for leaving us with that question, and maybe we can come back to that. I also really appreciate all the beautiful pictures of the kids riding bikes and making Oregon their home, and all the work that you all are doing to help make Oregon home for families. And so up next, we have Christine Zeller-Powell, and we are, who's once again, we're from here on out, we are outside of Portland. Christine is an immigration attorney at Catholic Charities Services of Lane County, and was one of the founders of Refugee Resettlement Coalition of Lane County. Christine, I will pass it on to you to share more about your work. And if you could also share a bit more about some of the barriers that refugee families face in their first year, and that would be awesome.
Great.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Christine Zeller-Powell, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk to you about refugee resettlement. So I'm in Lane County, and we are part of the broader Catholic Charities network, but we are actually named Catholic Community Services of Lane County. So we're a separate organization from Catholic Charities up in Portland, though we're colleagues in a number of ways. So we have at Catholic Community Services, we have a refugee and immigrant services program, and part of that is a refugee resettlement program. And to give a little bit of history about our program, it's kind of similar to, in some ways, to Salem for Refugees. So in 2016, 7 years ago, lots of community members were trying to get together to figure out how we could help welcome people who were fleeing persecution and violence. the Syrian refugee crisis was in the news at that time. And I think that was an inspiration for a lot of people to try to figure out how we could help. And so we learned that we needed a resettlement agency, but the nearest resettlement agencies were in Portland, and that was, they have a 100-mile radius. So we were just outside of that. So we needed our own resettlement agency to resettle people here in Lane County. So Catholic Community Services, in collaboration with the Refugee Resettlement Coalition of Lane County, became an official refugee resettlement agency, like the agencies in Portland. We have a slightly different contract. We are technically a remote placement program, and so we can resettle up to 35 individuals per year who have a US tie. And side note, the Afghan program was actually sort of outside of that, so we did resettle Afghans who do not have US ties here, but yeah, so starting in 2016, we got off to kind of a slow start due to low refugee admissions numbers for the country in general, but we've now resettled 42 individuals in our community. 33 of those are Afghans that arrived since last October. And then we provided case management services and immigration legal services to hundreds of refugees, asylum seekers, and other immigrants. So let's see. More of our work. I wanted to share with you a story about, so we have a lot of partners who stepped up in the fall to help us welcome our new Afghan neighbors. One of those partners was Lane Community College, and I feel like they went above and beyond to help get Afghans enrolled in ESL classes. We realized in the fall that due to their arrival dates, some of our new neighbors were missing registration deadlines for ESL classes at LCC and then having to wait months to start. We did have some volunteers who were providing tutoring as a sort of stopgap measure, but we wanted to get these folks in actual classes. So we were able to reach out to some of the Afghans who had been assigned to us for resettlement, but they were still on the military bases waiting to come here. And we connected them with one of our volunteers who is also an ESL teacher at LCC. She got them registered for ESL classes. And then in several cases, they were attending those Lane Community College classes while still being, they were attending remotely, so while they were still on base. And that was just a really great way to get folks jump-started on their English learning process. So we were really excited about that. And then we didn't have people arriving at the end of January having to wait until April to start classes. So that was one of the lessons we learned in resettling sort of a large number of people without a lot of time to get ready. Because while we'd only resettled individuals sort of, or a family at a time. So this was a new experience for us to resettle so many Afghans at once. And then I also wanted to share, because we had several years where we didn't have very many refugee arrivals, we also focused on working with asylum seekers and asylees. So asylees are people who've been granted asylum, which means they have been in the United States and been found to meet the definition of a refugee while here. And so we've worked with a number of Guatemalan asylees and Ugandan asylees, people from Cameroon, people from all over the world. And those individuals are not eligible for those 90-day initial resettlement services, but thanks to the funding through the state of Oregon, we have been able to provide extended case management and employment services to them. So that's been really great. In terms of challenges for us, two of the biggest things for getting refugees off to a good start is finding housing and employment. And we found that actually we have a lot of employment opportunities here. We have good employment opportunities through a variety of providing the service industry and then also manufacturing. Housing, of course, is a challenge. But we have been able to work with, we have a team of housing volunteers with the Refugee Resettlement Coalition that has done an incredible job of networking with local landlords and property management companies to help get these folks in housing. So that was successful, but we all needed to take a break after we got everybody out of the hotels in April. So let's see, I think you asked what are some of the top barriers faced by refugee families in their first year. So most of our experience has been with Afghans, and that's a slightly different population, I think, than who are experiencing some different challenges than maybe the refugee population in general. Because of the nature of the evacuation, There were a lot of individuals who were separated from their families. We have 9 men here out of our 33. We have 9 men whose wives and children are still in Afghanistan. And so that separation from family and that just fear and anxiety about their well-being has been an incredible burden for them. Also, because of the way folks were brought in, their legal status is parole, which is a temporary status, as opposed to when refugees are brought in with actual refugee status, that's a pathway to citizenship. And so we've seen these Afghans carrying the burden of that uncertainty about their permanent legal status. And that's been an incredible barrier and source of stress. So, I think, as you can imagine, for refugees in general, all the other barriers would fall under the category of, adjusting to life in a new country, learning a new language, new customs and culture. So I think that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. That is very helpful to give us a better understanding of the work that y'all been doing in Lane County. And so up next, we have our final panelist, Renee Cummings, who's Program Coordinator of the ERCO Eastern Oregon. And ERCO Eastern Oregon is located in Malheur County and serves roughly 100 refugee families from many countries. And they're located from, they're far from typical support structures. So Renee, I'd love to hear kind of more about your work and what are the unique challenges and opportunities that you see as a rural resettlement provider.
Thank you. I'm sure most of you have probably heard of ERCO as far as the Metro Portland area. They've been around almost 50 years. But like many of you, about 2015, 2016, Ontario area started seeing refugees coming here. Mainly for housing opportunities, trying to get out of the larger cities like Boise or Portland and trying to find places to live. And at that time, the community got together and put together an advisory group, which ultimately led to ERCO coming down and putting an office here. And we provided mainly support services for secondary migrants. We were not a resettlement agency, and so we've spent the last 4.5 years with employment programs and youth programs and early childhood programs, things like that. But in mid to late 2021, ERCO became a resettlement agency and started resettling refugees in that area. Early 2022, we were contacted by USCCB to become a remote placement site for individuals with US ties. And took a little while to get it done. We missed a couple families that really wanted to come, but we finally were approved, and we are expecting our first family any day now. We are checking the website every morning. So I'm not sure exactly when that will be, but had to be within 30 days. So we don't have too much longer to wait. Some of the challenges, I think, are probably pretty obvious when you're talking to a rural community. Transportation. It's something that's different with our secondary migrants because they have been here long enough that most of them came, the vast majority came with their own transportation. And with the exception of maybe helping them get around, helping them find the things they need, they had their own vehicles. This will be a little bit different. And we do have a limited public transportation system, runs a few hours a day and just in the immediate area. So that's going to be a challenge. Along with that, probably our biggest challenge has been culturally appropriate food. We do not have any, besides Japanese, Chinese, that's about, and Mexican, those are kind of the choices. So that's going to be challenging. we're hoping to get families who live here to be able to help with some of that, providing culturally appropriate food. Those are probably the two biggest challenges. But being in a small community like this also has its benefits. I know that having worked with Portland for quite a few years now, we get things done in a much faster, coordinated time frame. Everybody knows everybody in all the agencies here, and typically a phone call or a text message or an email is answered immediately. You know, we put out a list of what the families would need, and have been just generously, all of that stuff has been given, free storage for it. I mean, that's the one thing about a rural community is people come together. We have people so excited to go to the airport when that finally happens, and they don't care if it's the middle of the night or whatever. So there are definitely great things about being in a small community. We've also had our families report to us that they have very little conflict, either from the community or from within their own communities here. Maybe because you know there's only so many, you don't want to alienate your neighbors or people that you may depend on, but whether it's at school or in the workplace, they say they experience very little conflict. And some people just would rather live in the rural area, not having to drive to big cities and things like that. So our families that are here have created their own small groups and seem to be doing well. So we're hoping that that will benefit our new arrivals.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Renee.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and so just in this conversation, we've heard from resettlement agencies from all across the state, and what we've seen is that and heard about some of the challenges and opportunities that are ahead for us. So if we will start with Q&A. But before we do, perhaps we can go back to that question that Luke posed, and I'll throw it to you first. If you wanted to share more about what's the vision ahead for refugee resettlement. In the past 10 years have been transformational, and we've doubled the number of providers in the state. And so, what do you see is ahead?
I think right now for us, as for probably everybody, housing has been a struggle, but we have been doing some work on that in this community, and we have several new housing units, new housing buildings going up. And so we're hoping ERCO in Portland is certainly looking at when we have that capacity with being able to resettle more individuals here. So we're looking at that. We're also looking, you and I talked a little bit about sponsor circles. I think that fits our community perfectly. I think it's something that we definitely, as we get a little bit farther into this, we'll be looking at as a way to support this and make it sustainable over time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, would anybody else like to also add to that? And if it's easier to raise a hand, feel free to do that. Or just you can unmute and share. And the question again was just kind of, where do you see refugee resettlement going next in Oregon?
Yeah, I personally think that there's just a lot we can learn if we take the opportunity to sit back and really reflect on this last year. Maybe it even needs to wait a little bit longer until we've seen more of the Uniting for Ukraine individuals come through. But I would love for our community, legislators and resettlement providers to really sit back and say, okay, what are those core elements that really made for successful resettlement in our communities? And then how can we make that available to all refugees moving forward? As Matthew mentioned, extended case management has really been one of those pieces for our state. And I cannot imagine being in this role without being able to offer services beyond 90 days. I think for all of us, we couldn't imagine moving to a new country, learning a new language, getting new jobs, and feeling anywhere near settled after 90 days. So yeah, that's really my heart. I would love to see some of the successes. I would say the short-term housing program through ORIM was an incredible success and allowed for our agencies to know, at least when families were coming at a high pace, that there was a place where they could be housed in safe and clean and hospitable environment. Historically, we've relied on host homes and volunteers for that, which is great, but with the unpredictability of arrivals and timing, it was really nice to have that safety net. So those are just one example of the things that our state could do for all refugees moving forward.
I think I would just second all of those points made by Luke and by Renee. The expansion of refugee resettlement through other pathways, right? So United for Ukraine, private sponsorship, community co-sponsorship are very much needed. And how do we do that in partnership with service providers who have experience in that area, but by no means taking over the work, but supporting it in really close collaboration, I think is absolutely necessary. And I want to see us as refugee settlement agencies have the capacity and the focus to be a strong partners in that. I think it's absolutely necessary in order to continue refugee resettlement, not just in the state, but or not just where it currently is happening, but in other parts of the state, and have much more community involvement and participation in community support as well. And also an opportunity to really make sure that culturally specific CBOs, community-based organizations and nonprofits, how they can become part of that work in these new pathways is really, really important. I really want to see Department of Human Services. So it's the State Refugee Coordinator's Office is inside of Department of Human Services, ODHS. There's a lot of work going on with that team to increase their ability to partner with smaller CBOs, and I think encouraging them, being advocates with them as they look at that is also really important. And to Luke's last point on the temporary housing in the hotels through ORAM, I think there's a longer policy analysis that we could look at in terms of how what really was a housing first model is very successful. Housing first is normally discussed in the context of individuals who are chronically unhoused. This is a very different type of work, and I don't at all mean to collapse the two into each other whatsoever. The complexity of serving folks who are chronically unhoused and have experienced homelessness for a long time is very different than refugee resettlement housing efforts. But there's also a lot we can look at to show how a housing first model is extremely successful. And I don't know if this is a very technical way to talk about it from a policy perspective, but the housing through this in the hotels for the Afghan response. Oh, there we go. I mean, admittedly, up to $5 million or $6 million is going to be spent for the hotel operation going back to the beginning of October. So I don't in any way want to say that's a small amount of money, but I also don't think it's expensive. I think having a state committed in that way it demonstrates what an investment upfront on safe housing, accessible housing, temporary emergency shelter is able to make tremendous differences for the families that we welcome.
Thank you, Matthew. I think there's a lot more to talk about with housing. We can go down that line. But I do want to ask if folks have a question, please raise your hand or put a question in the chat so that we can make sure to answer your questions as well. Oh, I see Senator Jama has a question.
Thank you, Mical. This question is for Renee. Renee, can you say a little bit more about the 100 families or so folks that you serve? Where are they from? Which countries?
So our largest two groups are African, mainly Somali, and Middle Eastern, typically Syrian or Iraqi. We do have some Afghani families. We have had a Congolese family a couple times, but our biggest population is our Somali and Syrian families. I think it's partly the rural, the rural atmosphere maybe fits them a little better. They like growing the gardens and the weather here. But those are our biggest populations. We've had a little of a lot of things, but those seem to be who stays and makes this home.
Awesome. And yeah, and I think while we wait for more, feel free to raise questions and I will pause. But I do want to, Luke and Christine and a lot of other folks brought up the housing. And if we could get a chance to maybe talk more about that, it's because that's one of the motivations for expanding refugee resettlement outside of Oregon, outside of Portland, is the rising housing prices. Maybe Luke, if you don't mind explaining kind of what role does housing play in the whole resettlement effort from the beginning to kind of their families' long-term futures in Oregon.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So traditionally, I would say the first bit of housing that we look to secure for families is short-term housing. We often don't have a lot of timeline as far as when families will be arriving. And so there's really no ability to generally reserve units in advance of arrival. So that means we need to have a place for families to stay. And historically, that's been through volunteer host homes, people that have a mother-in-law suite, a basement apartment, are willing to share their home with another family. But as you can imagine, this can be sometimes uncomfortable for the host or for the family being hosted. And we want to limit the amount of time that families are in those hosted situations, especially if it's a shared environment. So we work very quickly then to try to secure permanent housing. And I think although the reason for moving resettlement to Salem was because of more housing availability at the time, I think across our state now we're experiencing that pinch in almost every community. And so it is a great challenge and puts a lot of stress on our team to find permanent units. And we're often going up against many barriers, right? We don't often meet the rental requirements that many landlords look in rent to income ratio, things like background checks. A lot of those required steps, it's harder for our families to achieve. So again, we're then relying on an even smaller pool of landlords and property owners who are willing to be flexible, who have maybe they only own one or two homes and they're willing to kind of take a risk on a refugee family. So housing is critical. I know here in Salem, we are already looking at what it would look like for us to partner and develop affordable housing. We've looked into church and faith community partnerships where they may already have land and would be willing to contribute land to be developed for this purpose. But of course, that takes a whole level of expertise and experience and a lot of funding to be able to pull off a large development like that. But I think resettlement agencies are going to need to get more and more creative to address this housing issue. At some point, if we fall into a recession or the market changes, housing will decrease as maybe one of the biggest challenges. And sometimes that pendulum then shifts to employment becoming a large issue. So right now, employment is not as strong of an issue for our agencies, but the housing is probably our greatest challenge.
Thank you. And yeah, I think I just want to give a quick shout out to it was as a part of the Afghan work, as we'll hear about more, and as Luke, you highlighted, one of the priorities was housing. And I think thanks to Senator Jama's kind of expertise in that area and that need that came up so presently. So yeah, does anybody else kind of want to add to, and Luke, you did kind of touched on the challenges and if there have been any interesting solutions or lessons learned in this area. I think I saw Christine was unmuted.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think one of the things that really made it possible for us to get Afghans out of the hotels and into housing was that we had this state provided rent assistance. And so that allowed Catholic Community Services to feel comfortable guaranteeing rent payments for these individuals who would not have otherwise qualified for, you know, for the property management's, you know, standards to get a lease. And so, you know, I would hope that in the future, maybe there could be some sort of pot of money that was available that we could know that we could count on in order to allow us to sign those kinds of guarantees again, because I think that's, you know, that's what made it happen. We'd gone through all of the friendly landlords and small folks that we could, and the last couple of families we needed to work with some of the bigger property management companies that have less flexibility. So that really helped us.
Thank you. Yes, thank you again. So I just got a chat message asking, I'd love to hear providers' experiences of what types of behavioral health supports have been most meaningful, mental health or otherwise. Is that some, maybe who would like to start us off for that one?
I could share just briefly about one maybe unintended mental health support that's happened in part due to the state support of short-term housing in the hotels, is that we saw just an immediate community being established as families were housed in the hotels together. In many cases, we've had singles who have chosen then to room together and go into permanent housing later on. Exploring the city together, you know, using that hotel as a launching place to explore and come back. And even in one case, we have two families who are not related who are choosing to house together to keep their costs down because of relationships that were established when they were housed together at the hotel. So I would say that's one kind of maybe unintended or unexpected benefit of the short-term housing that we've seen.
Thank you. That for that story. And I see Renee's also.
I was just gonna say, I mean, not new arrivals because we don't have any yet, but one of the things that's worked really well for us, for the youth, is before a youth ever starts school, they are invited and meet other youth who are from the same place, that speak the same language as them, and that's been a wonderful thing because kids go to school already knowing somebody here, and that's become one of our probably best resources for mental health for our youth, is just that feeling of already having some belonging before they enter the school system, because they definitely, you know, there's not a lot of kids, and so they definitely are a minority for sure. So
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we can, does Matthew or Christine, if you want to answer that, feel free to let me know. Or we can move on to our, oh, go ahead, Matthew.
Just really quick, I mean, I think we talk about mental health supports and the capacity of mental health providers. It's a longer discussion of how do we expand the capacity, and that's a multi-year project. I mean, that starts with focusing on programs at university level and developing pathways. But if we don't start that, we're going to be having the same conversation 10 years from now, 5 years from now, is that there's not enough culturally specific, culturally responsive mental health care providers. There's a lot of discussion about mental health care dollars being injected into the systems, and that's absolutely necessary. And we also I think we've got to move it upstream as well, and really focus in on how to make sure there's a really strong, robust workforce. I don't mean to talk about just in economic terms like workforce development, but I think we need to look at it from that perspective as well. That's on a high note to end on. I apologize.
No, I think what we're touching on is that the experiences that all Oregonians have and the challenges are many of the same ones that refugees and immigrants that refugees experience, but also they coming in with without that that support system that already exists, and so refugee resettlement agencies, I think, are that initial support system for families. So it makes sense that these are the tough and challenging issues that come up for everyone in our state. And I think I just wanted to wrap up by if folks wanted to share just one way that we can continue to support your work. And I'll put the links to your websites as well, to all the refugee resettlement agencies, so that people can learn more and follow your work. So starting off with Christine.
So I'm sorry, the question is, how can people support refugee resettlement, or our work in particular?
Yeah, or how can people support refugee resettlement or your work? I think those things are very related.
Yeah, I mean, I think two ways. It's the Refugee Resettlement Program is part of our national politics, and so I think we can't ignore that fact that our elected officials have a large have a lot of control over that system. Also, I think that supporting culturally based organizations is also a really great way to support our newest neighbors. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And how about Luke?
If you're in the Salem area, we would love to have you join one of our volunteer teams. As I mentioned, our organization focuses a lot on that extra support that volunteers can provide. So if you're interested in that, you can get connected with us on our website. I'm sure all of the other agencies also have lots of great opportunities to get involved. And if that doesn't work for you and you're sitting here with from a legislative office, we would just encourage you to continue this conversation. As I think all of us have hit on, there's a lot of ways that we could really improve this system, but that requires this dialogue to continue, and for us to share, those who are working directly with refugees or those with personal refugee experience, to be able to share with their legislators. So thank you so much for your openness over this last year to really partner, and I'm sure from years prior, but I've only been in this role for a year, so thank you.
Awesome. And how about Renee and then Matthew will close us out today.
So yeah, today, actually, this type of thing it helps our work a lot. We are a long ways from the Capitol, and sometimes people forget about Eastern Oregon. It doesn't seem like the natural place for refugees to be, but just don't forget about us, and thank you for inviting us today.
I think my ask my entry to all of this, just to continue, like Luke said, to continue the dialogue. There's such a, I think it's just a profound opportunity for us to recognize that we are all one family. And that can mean a lot of different things depending on faith tradition or personal beliefs. But this work is extremely grounding in that way, that you recognize we're all one family, and being part of welcoming new families and volunteering is one way to live up to that obligation to help your brothers and your sisters as they are rebuilding their lives. So all of us are nonprofits, right? All of us are very much in close connection with volunteers, and we are always looking to expand that network. And that's a wonderful way and incredibly impactful. There's so many stories of volunteers that have been connected to families for many, 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 many years. And it's just amazing to see what those partnerships are able to help those families achieve.
Thank you all so much for sharing and giving a peek into kind of the day-to-day work that you all do and the long-term vision for this work moving forward. And I also just want to thank Ken and Senator Jama's office and Talk and Luke and everybody who had a hand in organizing today's events. And I'll pass it back to Ken. Thank you all again.
Yeah, I'm just going to give a applause to all of the presenter today, including Mical, for moderating the panel. I think like Matthew mentioned that this is just the beginning, so I hope that you all will consider continuing the conversation, reaching out to the resettlement agency, and keep learning more and see how we can all work together. Thank you so much again, everyone. And with that said, we have one last workshop, which is going to begin at 3:10, focusing on legislative update on all of the recent investment made by the state. So yeah, feel free to take a break and join us again at 3:10 for our last workshop. Thanks so much, everyone.